touched on Odegaard there, so let's speak about him. You mentioned he's been maybe a bit off it in the last fortnight or so. He obviously made a really good start when he came back from injury. The stats before the Everton game were that he had created more chances than anyone else in the Premier League since coming back. Is this sort of drop off maybe just to be expected? It's an injured player who had a good come back to the team and noticeable, and now dropping off a bit because he's lacking maybe a bit of match fitness? Or is there something wider to be concerned about? If we've spoken about if Odegaard's not clicking, Arsenal aren't clicking, is that a wider concern? And is Odegaard's recent form a bit of a concern as well?
Well, he's just had a baby, literally, that coincides exactly with his drop off in form. So I don't know if he's getting no sleep at home. I think any new dad will testify to what that first fortnight is like. And so a lot of Arsenal fans are pointing to that and thinking that could well be an issue. And I think, like you said, sort of coming back from that injury, and you come back and you ride a crest of a wave a little bit, don't you, when you get back into the team, and it lifts everyone. And maybe now it's just sort of settling in. His body's struggling a little bit to cope with the demands. Or maybe he's just having an off period. It's tough to really put your finger on it, but he's definitely not been the best. I looked at the Fulham game last season. He took last week, and he took a bit of a kick early on in that game. And I wondered if that impacted him for the remainder of the match. But then that sort of form was carried on in the Champions League. I don't think he was at his best, and he definitely wasn't at his best against Everton. So there are some issues there. And look, when Odegaard doesn't play well, then Arsenal are they're nowhere near like the sort of same sort of team that we've come to expect from him. That he's so important to how they work, and that partnership with Saka and how he links everything together. And so when he's off colour, Arsenal ultimately are not the same side. They're not as threatening. But I still think every single Everton player on that pitch, when the board went up with 35 minutes to go and they saw Martin Odegaard's number on it and saw him trudging off and Ethan Nwaneri coming on, I bet there was a big collective sigh of relief of like, oh, I'm pretty happy about that, even though he hadn't been playing that well. I'd have liked to have seen Mikel do something a bit different in that second half, rather than, it was good. When I saw Nwaneri was coming on and was being given about 35 minutes, I'm like, oh, this is great. But I just expected him to come and play alongside Martin Odegaard and kind of have those two dovetailing together behind Havertz with Saka and Martinelli either side. Didn't think you really needed to keep Mikel Merino on in that game, given how it was panning out and how Everton were offering absolutely nothing going forward. I don't think Arsenal needed to worry too much about conceding in that game. So, was it a little bit conservative to do the like-for-like playmaker for playmaker? Couldn't you have put them both on together? That might have unlocked Everton and caused them different problems. Might have, created more space over on the left-hand side as well. I just felt like that was maybe the way to go, to just do that like-for-like. I don't think it really did much. And, as good as Nwaneri's been this season, he struggled to make any sort of impact. I think he only had about 10 touches on the 35 minutes he was on the pitch. It just didn't work at all. So I did look at those changes and think maybe he could have gone a different way, Mikel. He clearly tried to win the game with them, but it didn't work. And it's easy afterwards, isn't it, to sort of assess it and say, it hasn't worked. But maybe that was something he could have done differently.
Yeah, that's one of those changes where if it does come off, everyone's praising him for making that bold call and trying something different and unexpected. But, what was the feel in the stadium when that sub happened? Because I can imagine everyone's delighted to see Nwaneri get half an hour, but a bit bemused that Odegaard's off. But it comes back to that: if your player who is most likely to make a breakthrough isn't playing well, then do keep them on in the hope that they can do something magic. I go back to maybe England in the Euros with Harry Kane, staying on quite a long time, and the frustration growing that he wasn't subbed off. So it comes back to that a little bit, I suppose. Do you make that bold call and take off the player who's most likely to make something happen and take that risk, or do you take him off and try something different? Because I would argue that is trying something a bit different from Arteta.
Yeah, he was definitely trying something different. I don't think there was a widespread sort of shock at it. Certainly not in the stadium when it happened. But yeah, I just feel like he missed a bit of a trick with it. I think there's definitely been a lot of reflection since, because obviously, as you said, it didn't work. And when it doesn't work, then all the focus is on it. Mikel said it himself in his press conference afterwards. It's like, well, if Ethan comes on and scores a goal, then suddenly it's the greatest substitution of ever. But obviously it didn't work. And you have to, when you make those sort of calls, you have to sort of live and die by the results, don't you? And ultimately, it didn't quite work out for him there. But at the time, I liked it. As I said, when I looked up and I saw he was doing what he was doing, and I saw Ethan was coming on and getting a proper amount of time, I thought that's good. But it's just, did you really need to take over? Mikel Merino is he's having a kind of slow start to his Arsenal career, and he's neat and tidy, but he's playing in that left 8 role at the weekend, and he never really offered threat or goal of scoring a goal or getting into the box and creating something. He created one opportunity for Odegaard in the first half, but it just felt like the way that game was going, you didn't really need to keep him on and have like Jorginho behind him, because Jorginho came on for Rice at the same time that Odegaard and Nwaneri sub. It just felt like you didn't need to do that. The way the game was shaping out, maybe you could be a little bit more attacking. So that's kind of how I felt at the time, and nothing that I saw on those 35 minutes that sort of followed it convinced me that I was wrong.
I suppose that feeds a bit into the narrative that Arteta is becoming, or maybe has always been, a more naturally sort of defensive-minded coach, and worries about not losing the game before going and winning the game. If I'm going to mention the Liverpool game at the weekend because that's the game I watched most. Arne Slot, when Liverpool went down to 10 men because they were trailing, he didn't bring on another defender to replace Andy Robertson. He changed things around and they looked defensively dodgy for quite a while afterwards, but then found that solution which kept attackers on the pitch. And then even at the end of the game, obviously they were chasing the win, but had 4 attackers on the pitch, I think it was, and never stopped going for it. Harking back to the Jurgen Klopp era, and certainly Pep Guardiola always goes for that win. Is that maybe a difference between the managers? Would Arteta maybe would go for caution above going all out for the win?
Yeah, potentially. I mean, we know Mikel, he loves control. That's the big thing with Mikel. And I think that first season when Arsenal challenged for the title, which was so unexpected, the thing about him that season, it was chaos, and it was brilliant. It was thrilling. It was unexpected, but it was chaos. And I think the way that season fell apart right at the end maybe has shaped the Mikel Arteta we've seen in the last couple of years, where he's definitely moved more towards control. Even in the game, even in the press conference after the draw at the weekend, he was talking about how they gave Everton nothing, and it was all sort of defensively, it was really excellent, and things like that. And again, he looks at that and he thinks that's really, really positive. Whereas maybe some fans will think, you know what, just move away from that a little bit and just go a bit more attacking. Try and be a bit more unpredictable when it comes to your team selections. And there was a change at the start of last season, certainly with some of the signings that Arsenal made. They didn't quite work out, like the Havertz one, for example, of being in midfield. That he was brought in and you thought you could play in midfield, but you can then play him up front. You can play Rice as a 6, you can play him as an 8. You can be a little bit more unpredictable in terms of how you sort of put your team selection out. But I feel like Arsenal are a little bit more, you kind of know who's going to play where and things at the moment. And maybe a lot of that's down to injuries and the players that they're missing at the back that have been unable to do what he wanted to do this season. But yeah, I think he's definitely, there's no doubt that he's a fairly conservative manager and he wants that control more than anything else. And if you have that control, and then you can go on and you can win games and you can score goals at the end because you're so dominant. But at the moment, the control is coming back. I think the last two, you look at Fulham, you look at Everton, they conceded 4 shots in those 2 games. So they have been very, very dominant in that way. But has that been a detrimental effect to their attack? And I think you look at the numbers and say it kind of has a little bit.
I mean, they do still score quite a lot of goals as well, don't they? So it's not like he's a completely defensive manager. We should
no, and it could click like that as well. Like there was a very similar period last December when Arsenal lost to Fulham, they lost to West Ham, and they couldn't score. They weren't really creating any chances. And again, we were having a very similar conversation, Arsenal fans at that time than they are now. And then bang, it clicked, and it all started. They were scoring freely again. You've got to remember they scored 3 really good goals in midweek in the Champions League as well. And I think the Champions League needs to be taken into account slightly. Again, I'm not using it as an excuse, but you look at the results across Europe this weekend, and the teams who have been in the Champions League, they've struggled, really struggled. And Arsenal have had about 4 games in 10 days. Everton have had none in 10, and they've just came with a game plan of, we are drawing this game 0-0. It was so glaringly obvious to see, and they did it very, very well. And that's not, I'm not having to go at Everton for that, but there are sort of slight mitigating factors in what happened. And I still don't think it's an absolute disaster. It felt like a real body blow because it was another opportunity that they've passed up 2 successive weekends. Against Fulham, they could have clawed back 3 points on Liverpool because Liverpool didn't play. They didn't take advantage. This weekend, Liverpool held at home to Fulham. Again, Arsenal didn't take advantage. And you've seen Chelsea sort of march on and move ahead of Arsenal now. So that's added to the frustration. But they're still there. I don't think they're out of it yet, but they've absolutely got to find a way to start hurting teams and stretching teams more when they come to the Emirates and they play in the way that Everton do, because they're going to come up against these teams a lot in the second half of the season, and they've got to find a way of being able to break them down when they're not on their best of form.